Now I'm going to introduce our speaker, Mrs. Renee Franzwa, who is who is the Director of Education at MAPS, which stands for Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. So Renee, your career has been focused on education. You've built products and programs for UCLA, Stanford University, General Assembly, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, EdSurge, Unity. I mean, the list goes on. And now you're building programs for MAPS. And then in addition, you are currently researching your first book. So we will touch on that. But I want to start with the therapeutic application of psychedelics. So Renee, can you kick off by sharing a little bit of your journey and how you became involved in MAPS and alternative therapies for mental health?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. And I did want to do a little audience question at one point, but we can save that for the next question, or should we just go ahead and kick it off with that?
Let's do it. Yeah, they can answer in chat.
Yeah, perfect. So yeah, I just kind of want to know if this is the first time that you're hearing about psychedelics, or maybe early on your journey, or maybe you've used a little bit recreationally or know friends that have, but you haven't really considered psychedelics in this context before. And maybe those that are more involved, that have used psychedelics and are either excited to advance your understanding in more of these mental health and therapeutic uses, or kind of more advancing your experience in them. So, how would you identify the first being fairly new, or the second being I kind of know something about it, but I want to learn more?
Mm.
Cool. While people are answering, I'll go ahead and give my background and how I came into this role and in this space in particular. So yeah, so as you said, my whole career has been in education. I've been sort of this passion point, where this obsession of where experiential education, where I ran internships in the Galapagos Islands with indigenous kids from like the highlands of Ecuador, to working in Ghana, where I started a nonprofit and worked with interns from the US. And just what was on the ground. It was always in person, and then started a company when I came back to the US because I was having a lot of health issues. So then I sort of broke into the tech scene, and being in the Bay Area, from the Bay Area, I was just became really interested in how could we enhance the digital experience with the experiential. So for example, how could you participate in online learning, but then have cohorts like what we're doing here today, right? Like you could all go home and read a book about mental health, but having community that's experiential. And so it's that intersection of experiential and digital. And so I became really interested in this intersection, and that's kind of been this passion point in my career, but always through this human rights lens. And over the years, had some really big hits to my ego, to my sense of self, particularly professionally over the years, where I was like an entrepreneur, and then the company failed, and I got laid off from a job, and I was really questioning my quality of, my whole self. I blamed myself for everything. And then I had some things really fall apart post COVID, both a relationship that ended and some betrayals from friendships. And at that point, I could no longer just be fine. And I really tried antidepressants. I tried a lot of the things that therapists tell you to try. But it wasn't until I talked to friends and realized that psychedelics could be a route for me. So I found a sitter, which is what they call, like, some people call it a guide, or but someone that basically was just, they say, like, don't trip alone. So if you're going to do this for your first time, don't do it alone. Have someone in the room with you that will help you to entirely focus on yourself. Took 5 grams of psilocybin and went on this huge personal journey, wore an eye mask, listened to music. It was about 4 hours. And some of it was really difficult. Like at first to come up, I was like, I had this image of my mouth just turning inside out and swallowing my whole body. And but it wasn't terrifying. It was just hard. And I had learned to breathe, and I did a lot of preparation. I talked to a lot of people. So I really knew what I was getting into. But then I went into this phase where it was just this beaming sense of self-love. And then I was being so cruel and mean to myself, and carrying so much weight based on relationships I had with others, and really holding them too much accountable too, that these were people that were hurt, that hurt me. And its connection to earth and to community that I just had never experienced before. It was this massive download. But afterwards, I came out of that and I came home and I didn't know what to do. I actually called you, Amy. And I came home and I was like doing carpet angels, listening to Pink Floyd, and like I could barely leave the house. I didn't know like what to do with all this information. And so I learned this word integration, which is basically how to take a big experience, a big journey like that, and to then use these tools like journaling and community and talking about it. There's a whole lot of really great integration tactics out there. And if you ask one person what integration is, it's gonna be totally different from what somebody else says integration is. But there's a lot of ways to just process and integrate those learnings into your life. I always say after a big journey, don't quit your job, don't break up with your partner, don't cut your bangs. Take a minute and breathe and process, and then maybe think about what you want to do with it. And so what I had to download was that I'd been working in education, but I really wanted to use this skill set in the mental health space. And especially being social justice oriented, I wanted to see more people talk about their mental health in a way that I, was finding a new format to do that. So I started researching psychedelics, and that was about a year and a half ago. And I learned about MAPS very quickly. They're the real leader in the space. So now I'm designing programs and talking to people about mental health and decriminalization and social justice and all kinds of things every day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that, Renee. Thank you for sharing. And I love what you said too about a sitter. We're all about educating yourself, being intentional, being safe. They say psychedelic assisted therapy for a reason. The assisted is very important. And so I'd love to hear, Renee, in terms of having a sitter, and, there are some people that wrote in chat, they're new to this, they don't know a lot about it.
Great.
What are some tips that you would give someone who's newly kind of getting into this space for assistance with their mental health?
Yeah, I think most people find psychedelics through friends, right? Peer-to-peer education, especially because these substances, whether it's plant medicine or chemical compounds like MDMA or LSD, most people find out through their friends. I would say that's great and that's important, but there are tools out there that I wish I had known about. So MAPS is full of rich information. There's also a really great program called Drugs Over Dinner, which is a kit you can download, and it basically has these questions on how to like host a dinner with people, whether it's parents and kids, or especially if you're a parent, you want to start talking to your kids about drugs in any way. And I say drugs really broadly. I'll come back to the social justice component of why I call them drugs and not just psychedelics. But there's a great way to educate yourself both through peers as well as doing research and finding really quality information out there. There's also ways, for example, like the Zendo project can help you learn about the harms and the risks that are out there. I am not a doctor. I'm not here to tell anyone. This is your disclaimer note that I think that there's a lot of really great information that you need to find. And I'm not recommending you do this, but there are really great tools out there to at least learn about it.
Yeah, thanks, Renee. And then as part of your journey in use of psilocybin, I'm curious, was there anything that surprised you?
A couple things. So one is I am celiac, and so I've got an autoimmune disease, and that means that I carry a lot of that stress over the years. A lot of that times that I was sick, I was diagnosed a little over 10 years ago, and during that time that I was sick, the stress and at any time I would eat something that would make me sick, I owned that even more. After the psilocybin journey, my stomach just relaxed, and I rarely get sick anymore. Now, this is not something that I've seen any major research around, but for me, I've read a lot more material around the mind-gut connection and how much nutrition, and I talk about poop a lot now. You're welcome, my boyfriend. I talk about all kinds of things about digestion and food in a really interesting way, and I'm kind of obsessed with the future of like microbiome and microbiomes, mental health, autoimmune diseases, and mental health. And I feel like psychedelics, because it had that self-love component and it just advanced my mental health and my relationship to my body so much, that was really surprising. Yeah, something else that was surprising that I've been learning more about is that those that take psychedelics that are traditionally narcissistic personalities can become more narcissistic. So in the same way that I experienced this sense of self-love, I was really surprised to learn that, this is why there's risks out there and you don't want to tell everybody to take psychedelics. This is not a solution that everybody should be doubling down on. I think that there are some risks of sort of creating a bit of a God complex for people that can actually make them feel like they are truly God. They are truly better than others. And I think that that's also something that's really early in research, but something I'm learning being in the space more. So I think those are the two under-researched but surprising things.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, Renee, that's I'm seeing the chat light up too. That's very, very interesting, especially on ShareWell. We have a lot of support groups for people who have experienced narcissistic abuse. So yeah, very, very relevant. And so let's dive a little deeper into this. So psychedelics have shown promise as therapies for treatment resistant depression and PTSD. That's kind of the most common that I've heard in research studies. But I'm curious, you're talking about the, gut microbiome, autoimmune kind of aspect. And now you just brought up narcissistic personality disorder. Is there anything else that you can share about, what psychedelics new research is showing to help in terms of mental health?
So I'm not on the research or policy side, and I don't feel super qualified to talk too much about that. What I can say is I'm very interested in the cultural shifts coming from a background in education, and especially having worked around the globe. I feel like there's a mindset shift that I'm excited about, where people can start talking about psychedelics in a way that is not going to get you arrested or fired from your job. And I think that that's really exciting. But I know, a lot of folks are talking about MDMA for couples therapy, or even if you're going through a divorce, how it could ease the pain between two people to do, to try psychedelic therapy. I think that there's family trauma, which, we can talk a bit about. That's a lot of what my book is digging into a bit, as well as death doulas. If you're familiar with birth doulas, that would be in the room with you, that are really supporting you holistically, spiritually, through a birth. Death doula would be there to do the same, as well as supporting your family. And this is something that psychedelics are really a growing field in. There's also some really interesting work being done in conflict areas. So, for example, in Israel and Palestine, there's some really early work being done with ayahuasca ceremonies to help people heal from the harm. And we're talking about Israelis and Palestinians in the same room, shall we say. So there's some really exciting stuff going on. But again, I can't quote too much around that because it's just not my area of expertise. But I could certainly share some resources.
Yeah, no, thank you, Renee. This is really helpful. It's really expanding my mind, and I'm sure the audience's mind on the applications of this. So thank you so much. Being in this space, I'm sure that you face criticism, right? Like we're in this kind of what people call a psychedelic renaissance. It's become more mainstream now, but that means there's more mainstream criticism. So how do you deal with that in your role?
Yeah, I think that there's a component that we've been taught to fear these medicines, plants, substances, drugs, depending on what language you want to use. But I learned an interesting statistic recently that when someone is admitted to a hospital, whether they are already deceased on arrival or they are high on arrival, that the hospital only has one checkbox, and it's that they're on hallucinogens. There's nothing distinguishing alcohol, marijuana, methamphetamine. And so, even from the perspective of the public health system, they don't distinguish what these medicines are. And I think we have some systems in place, and obviously there's a lot of fear-based tactics that I think have, a lot of basis in the pharmaceutical industry, as well as the drug cartels. The war on drugs is very real. And, no one wants to write a headline about somebody that had this amazing trip and changed their life and became a better person. They want to read a headline that's like, oh no, something bad happened, because that's headline making news. It's gossipy, it's clickbait. And so I feel like I try to support getting those stories out. I think that as soon as you start talking to people, for example, one of the programs I'm running is a first responder training. Denver has legalized psilocybin, decriminalized. And so it's accessible. And so what that means is that we've created a program at MAPS to train first responders, EMS, police, and fire, how to respond to someone that's having a psychedelic crisis. And this basically means, understanding the difference of the substance involved and how to support them so that they don't go further into crisis, that you can support them and guide them through that. Because sirens and, especially a gun can really traumatize someone, right? And so I was talking to someone that he's an EDD and education doctorate that basically creates a lot of these trainings. And we got on the phone with him to talk about scaling it outside of Denver. And he said, I actually have a friend whose daughter who has been on and off different pharmaceuticals most of her teenage life. And until she tried ketamine therapy, nothing was working. And now she's transformed. Mm-hmm. And this is that story that I want other people to know, that these are the stories out there that are not making headlines. And so talk to friends and find out about it. And when I get, folks fighting back or pushing back on this work or being highly critical, I say, who do you know that has experienced these, psychedelics or these different substances? The other thing that I think is really critical is when you think about an Indigenous perspective, human history, we have always gone and danced by a fire to the beat of a drum, stayed up late, not eating. There's a human history of community and gathering, and we've lost a sense of community. We're in a world where loneliness is an epidemic. It's really critical that we find some place to come back to that in some way, whether it's in our own living rooms or it's out at a retreat. But I think that movement in community, with or without psychedelics, there's a piece of that if it's the substance that makes you nervous, then maybe try some ways to be around other people that are maybe experimenting with them and be in community with them and see how they are. And that's a great introductory as well.
I love that, Renee. Yeah, and I'm curious to know about other programs that you're specific, like research projects or programs that you're working on with MAPS, if you can share. I know some are behind the scenes.
I would say the most exciting thing we're doing is a massive public awareness campaign. So if you think about, the just say no and the sort of war on drugs language, we want to create something that's going to tell the world about the positive and the benefits. Obviously, with a balance of, risk, it's the two sides of the same coin. But I think it's sort of the difference of like, don't drink versus drink responsibly, right? It's not like don't trip at all, but don't trip alone, right? Or go slow. And there's a lot of really great programs that are happening, especially at college campuses, of course, because that's where all the best innovation in education is happening. Students know what's up. And it's one of the most, glorious times for community and mind expansion and personal development. And so, there's a lot of really great work happening on campuses. So the public awareness campaign is probably the most exciting thing. There's also movements happening in the EU and at the UN and happening at a global level that I've just started researching, and we'll be meeting people in person over the coming month or two to dig into what public education could look like and how to really create a coalition around the world that can talk about this, because the US is really advancing from a medical research and policy perspective. We're starting to talk about and share those successes and see some successes. So now we need to figure out how can we help advance policy in other places that may not have access. So we have like a global therapist training program that's been working they're coming up for another one in Sarajevo. That's really thinking about conflict areas and how we can train therapists there. And they can come from all over the place to meet with MAPS and do the training. And a lot of them have to do it anonymously because they're doing this at high risk to their safety and well-being. But because they believe so deeply in this kind of therapy and the opportunity to heal their local communities, they can go home from, really remote locations. So that's another thing I'm really excited that MAPS is doing.
Wow. Yeah, I really want to dig into that more, Renee. But for time's sake, yeah, I'll move on. I mean, you're just doing such incredible work at MAPS. And I wanted to also bring up your book as well, because that's very interesting. Can you tell us about some of the research that you're doing there?
Yeah, so I'm just going to be super honest about how this started. I feel like I need to talk to May about my origin story and like craft it a little better, but I'll just be straightforward right now that I basically was looking for an opportunity how to get my career going in this space. And so I have a friend that grows and sells mushrooms, and I interviewed him and like did a formal research, study, and like formal for me. It was a personal research study, right? I wasn't publishing this anywhere. I just am very tactical. I'm neurospicy, so I need order. Anyway, so I sat down with him and met with them 2 or 3 times. And the one question that really stood out was, what's the most interesting client, or what's the most interesting thing that your clients are telling you about the mushrooms they're buying from you? And he said, how many of them are giving them to their parents? And you'll see this if you've read Michael Pollan's book or seen the Netflix series. There's a lot of folks that are facing this sort of identity crisis as you get older, feeling further away. And that loneliness epidemic is very real for folks as they age. You start to see your body change, your faculties, your place in the workforce. Ageism is very real. We're no longer living in community as people age, and seeing your friends get sick and pass away. And so basically I decided to start researching that and have discovered some really beautiful stories about basically what I'm calling the boomer generation, that is the first psychonauts, which are, it's a sort of a community term for those that experiment with psychedelics. And they're the first to experiment with psychedelics in the 60s, right? And so now they might be the first generation that experiment with psychedelics, not just end of life in the death doula context, but really leading up to that to create new chapters and new connection to people and community. But in particular, I think there's also generational trauma. And I think that that's why we're seeing so many kids give the mushrooms to their parents, is because they want to see their parents be able to talk about mental health in a way that was not safe in their generation. Where it's safer in younger generations now, we are talking about mental health in a way that is, to me, like, it makes the next generation, to me, like, makes me so excited. But to be able to open your parents up, or aunts and uncles or friends, or if you're working in a space with folks that are, in their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, again, think about the risks, but the stories are what I'm writing about. And that's what my book is about.
I love that, Renee. Well, I am very excited for it to come out and read all of the stories.
Me too.
And then I'm looking at the chat right now, and I'm seeing quite a few questions. We'll launch into the Q&A. But I'll start with actually microdosing, because we've gotten a few comments about that. I'd love to know your stance on microdosing. And then as Renee answers, the rest of you continue to type in questions, and we'll switch over to the Q&A after this.
Yeah, great question. There are some really great journals, books. I think that Mommies Who Mushroom, there's a lot of context for microdosing. And I think especially if you want to start experimenting with psychedelics, it could be a great taste test. I talk about everything related to food. So when I talk about education, I talk about tastes, snack size, and full meals. And so when you're thinking about trying something new or learning about something new, try to get, a little taste and see how you feel. I think there's a lot, again, I'm not a researcher on this, not in the policy side, but I know I can talk about my personal experience with microdosing. I am ADHD, and I've always been able to manage that through physical activity. But over the years, as my physical well-being. I did marathons and triathlons. Like, I mean, it was like if I wasn't kinetically moving, my brain was growing cobwebs. And now as I've gotten older, I'm growing more cobwebs. And so I've started experimenting. So Adderall was really, really difficult for me. It made me all the things, right? Jittery, it made me hard sleep. I was really emotional afterwards. I felt aggro. And so I started experimenting with microdosing, and it's really been beneficial for me. I find that it sort of leaves my heart a little open, and I feel really, because I think so much of being neurodivergent, there's a lot of self-talk that goes on. The brain never stops chattering, and sometimes it can get really negative. And I think that because these medicines, these substances can create a lot of self-love in these little micro experiences without causing visual experience or a shift in reality. It's like just creates a little frosting on the world. It just keeps it a little bit nicer and easier. And I think that has helped me with my productivity a lot. I know musicians and a lot of people that are experimenting with LSD, as well as even MDMA. I think there's a lot of, but yeah, there's some great research out there. But again, just sharing my personal experience, not promoting anything here.
Well, Renee, thank you so much for your time. It was really, really insightful. Thank you so much. Very, very powerful. I've got a lot of things that I want to research now.
Thanks so much, Amy. And thank you everyone for participating. Please, if there's anything helpful in here, go out and tell others about it. share the education, both the risks and the benefits. But thank you so much for having me. It's really important to me that we start sharing this information, this education for people to understand what's going on.
Wonderful. Okay, bye everyone.